My name is Jessica Unger, and I'm the Emergency Programs Coordinator here at the Foundation of the American Institute for Conservation. We're so pleased to be able to offer today's program as a part of a webinar series that addresses the needs of the Alliance for Response community and other cooperative disaster networks nationwide. These programs are made possible through the generous support of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I'm so glad to see so many familiar faces, people who were able to join us for past programs in this webinar series, and I hope that you will likewise be able to join us for our final webinar, which will take place this Thursday at 1 p.m. on the best practices for seeking funding. We're really fortunate to be joined for that program by the Manager of Disaster Fundraising at the American Red Cross. Before we dive into today's presentations, I just wanted to share a couple of brief technical notes. On your screen, you'll see several boxes, including one labeled Chat on the left side, one labeled Web Links, and one labeled Files on the bottom. Use the chat box to say hello, ask questions, and share information. If you post a question, you'll receive a response either from me or from my colleague, Emily Conforto. Any questions will be noted, collected, and I will ask them of the presenter. To use the Web Links box, click on the link that you want to see and highlight it in blue. Then click on the Browse To button to go to that site. In the Files box, likewise, click on the file you want to download, highlighted blue, and then click the Download File button. An additional note for today's program, our presenter will be making use of the raised hand function. At the top of your screen, you'll notice an icon with a raised hand, so when the time comes, please be sure to use that feature if it applies to you. If you're unable to attend Thursday's session or missed a past program in this series, don't worry. We've been recording all programs and hosting the sessions on AIC's YouTube channel, which is available at youtube.com/user/AI Conservation. An easier way to do that is to just click on the web links box under the AIC YouTube channel. We've been aiming to get all of the sessions up within a week of the webinar date, and often they're just up within a couple of days, so do keep an eye on that for today's recording as well. For those who aren't familiar with the Alliance for Response Initiative, I just wanted to give a bit of context about the history and goals of the program. Alliance for Response began almost 15 years ago with a key mission in mind: to help communities more effectively protect their cultural and historic resources. The immediate objectives are to build relationships, initiating an ongoing dialogue between cultural institutions and emergency managers and first responders. To educate cultural heritage and emergency management professionals, working to raise awareness of the need to protect cultural and historic resources within communities, encourage disaster planning and mitigation at archives, historic sites, libraries, and museums, and of course, to develop strong, ongoing networks to facilitate effective local response. Today's topic of crisis communications is central to almost all of these goals, so we're really fortunate to be joined today by a speaker and a discussant who can address this topic with years of expertise. Many of you might be familiar with Alliance for Response as an initiative of heritage preservation. In May of 2015, Heritage Preservation closed its doors, but fortunately many of its programs transferred to the Foundation of the American Institute for Conservation at that time. Alliance for Response and other emergency initiatives at Heritage Preservation joined forces with the emergency initiatives currently underway at FAIC, including the National Heritage Responders, formerly known as AIC CERT, a team of trained collections care professionals who can provide on-the-ground support for impacted cultural heritage institutions. You can find out more information about the National Alliance for Response Initiative and the existing networks by visiting our website at heritageemergency.org/AFR. You can access the link by clicking on the web links box below. Before I turn things over, we just wanted to get a quick sense of who was on the webinar today. So to that end, we have a few quick poll questions. Those of you who have been on sessions before will be very familiar with these. First up, you currently involved with an Alliance for Response network? We've seen a really nice range of responses to this question over the last 4 sessions, and we're seeing similar response this time, so we're getting about a split of 55% currently yes involved with an AFR network and 45% no. So that's great. Okay, next up, if you are involved with Alliance for Response, Do you know anyone who is... Oops, sorry, I'm going to reopen this. Apologies, I just need to clear out. Okay, sorry about that. No, please go ahead and share your responses. So if involved with AFR, do you know anyone from a network outside of your region? It is really wonderful to see how many of you are already in communication with others. And some networks even have agreements in place. That's certainly kind of activity we want to encourage. So, okay, we're seeing, yes, about 60% of you are in communication and about 40% of you currently are not, so an opportunity in the future. And then our final poll question here, one moment. If you're joining us today from the US, what region are you joining us from? Now note that this is different from some of the past questions that we've asked. So we have changed some of the regions here and have included the states next to them. So please use that as a guide to say where you're joining us from today. Great, so wonderful representation from the Mid-Atlantic, some folks from the Southeast, and a few from the West as well. Great. All right, thank you so much. Those are always really helpful for us to get a better sense of who's on the program today and for the benefit of our presenters as well. So today we're incredibly fortunate to be joined by our fantastic presenter Mike Smith and our wonderful discussant Steve Pine. Michael Smith, PhD, is chair of the Communication Department at LaSalle University in Philadelphia. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in public relations, organizational communication, and conflict. As a trainer and consultant for LaSalle's Nonprofit Center, he has worked with a variety of nonprofits, including the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, CCAHA. And I think I saw some folks from CCAHA on the program today. For several years, he presented CCAHA-sponsored disaster mitigation and recovery workshops to cultural institutions around the country, and recently served as a part of the crisis planning team at LaSalle. Steve Pine is Senior Decorative Arts Conservator at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. He is a member of the National Heritage Responders, co-chair of the Texas Cultural Emergency Response Network, Texas SARA, an AFR network, and serves on the Advisory Committee for Alliance for Response and the New York City Alliance for Response group. Steve is also a past chair of the AIC Emergency Committee. He has been deployed to assist public and private collections following Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Ike, and Superstorm Sandy. And with that, I'm pleased to turn things over to Mike Smith. Mike, take it away.
Hello everyone, how are we today? Hopefully my volume is coming through. My system sort of logged out here for a minute. I think we're back on track though. I want to welcome... Okay, great, thanks Jess. I want to welcome everyone to this afternoon's seminar, and for those of you in LA, I will pass you a cup of coffee if I could, but I'm really happy to see everyone here. I've really appreciated over the years the work that I've done with various cultural institutions and the work that you do for communities, and anything that we can do to help preserve and protect the heritage that you conserve is an important thing. I want to go over the agenda that we'll be following for the next hour or so before we turn it over to Steve. We've already had a little bit of an introduction to the goals of this whole series as well as today's webinar. We're going to talk a little bit for a few minutes about crisis definition and the characteristics of a crisis or a disaster. The reason we do this is because it really does guide a lot of the planning that we do as we go forward. Then we'll talk a little bit about anticipating crises and some of the work that you do before a crisis or a disaster strikes. Then we'll talk about creating the crisis communication plan and some of the nuts and bolts and tools for doing that. And then finally implementing the plan in post-crisis recovery, what do you do after the media leaves and you still have to communicate with all the people who are important to the organization? As we begin here, I'm going to draw on a little Disney inspiration. I think I spent a little too much time with my granddaughter over the holidays here, but I want to congratulate you on the work that, first of all, on facing up to the fact that disasters might strike your organization. I know that many of you have been involved in emergency preservation for a number of years, but it's still encouraging to see the number who show up for a seminar like this. In my work with LaSalle's Nonprofit Center, I would do two kinds of seminars, one on media relations and telling your story and promoting the organization, and then the crisis communication one. The media relations one was always standing room only, and the crisis communication one, had 2 or 3 people in it, because it's really difficult to face this, to confront the reality of what could possibly happen to your organizations. You either, have the inclination to do something like this, duck and cover and hide from things, or, and if this is still part of your emergency training, then I guess you're preparing for a disaster that I'm not aware of, or to get panicked and scream a little bit about what might happen. But all of you here today are being brave in facing up to the challenges that might happen during a crisis. And so I congratulate you on that and encourage you to keep spreading the word about being prepared and how that can help your organizations recover in case something does in fact happen. I want to spend, as I mentioned before, a few minutes defining a crisis, because again, the characteristics of a crisis help guide us in developing a plan. I'd like you for a moment, and you don't necessarily have to answer this in the chat area, but when you think of crises and disasters, what comes to mind? For some people, traffic on the way to work becomes a crisis for them. An overheated burrito in a microwave can cause a crisis for some people. But for those of us who are planning disaster recovery for organizations, I think crises take on a whole new meaning. I ask you to think of this question so that you can get in the mindset of imagining what might happen to your organizations as we walk through some of the communication steps that you might take as we create a plan. There are a number of definitions of what actually constitutes a crisis, but for me and for the purposes of this webinar, I would define a crisis as something that is immediate, significant, dramatic, threatening, and stressful. An event that characterizes, that has those characteristics. So what do I mean by these things? A crisis is immediate, they're unfolding in real time, decisions can't be delayed. The need for information is immediate, both from the media, from first responders, from your stakeholders, from your volunteers, from your staff. They need information about how to respond to the crisis, and they can't wait for you to look it up, to consult somebody, to research. The information needs to be coming pretty quickly. Crises are also significant. They can severely disrupt your operations. They can, unfortunately, damage or destroy your collections or structure. And they can displace employees and volunteer staff. A few years ago, and I'll refer to this story again in a moment, we moved my son to college down in Florida in the middle of a tropical storm. And not only were we a little inconvenienced because the storm shut down campus for 4 days, but most of the employees of the institution were displaced from their own homes. And so to be able to respond to our needs took a lot longer because of that. Particularly with the kinds of disasters that I know the Network for Response has faced before, I think that you understand the notion of significance here. They're dramatic. Disasters are spectacular. Things falling over, things flooding, things in flames. And hopefully I'm, by the way, not giving you indigestion after eating lunch here when we begin to think about all these, but the thing about being dramatic is that that is what feeds media coverage of disasters. They look for the most dramatic footage of something happening to an organization, and you hope that it isn't yours. But it also, again, prepares you for the fact that the media and other people are going to be paying attention to the responses that you make. They're threatening. Poor recovery can threaten the existence of your organization. If you lose a collection because of flood or fire damage or earthquakes, there might not be a reason for your organization to exist. And then finally, they're stressful. And I speak about stress, and I think about stress in a couple of different ways. First, they're emotionally and physically stressful. Physically stressful, you're up for many hours, there's lots of decisions to be made, those decisions are high pressure. Stressed people make poor decisions, which is why a good crisis preparation plan is very important. If you have clear guidelines on how to respond to things, you don't have to worry about making many decisions in the moment. I mean, there are a lot of things that you will have to respond to, but knowing what to say to the media initially shouldn't be one of those things if you've prepared ahead of time. I'll also say that they're stressful on communication systems, and later on when we talk about the ways that you want to build capacity for communication, we'll talk about this again, but in some studies of disasters, I'm particularly familiar with campus events like campus crime or school shootings or those sorts of things. Website traffic, trying to get information, has crashed servers. The website traffic at least triples, if not more. And then any other sorts of communication channels that you use, social media, phone banks, those sorts of things are also stressed to the max. So how do you prepare for that sort of stress on a communication system? That's some of the things, those are some of the things that we'll talk about here in a few moments. Right? Again, as I mentioned a moment ago, the reason for thinking about these is because they help guide the principles for what goes into a plan. One case I'm going to refer to throughout the presentation is a flood that occurred at the Kentucky Derby Museum in Louisville. Both my daughter and wife are big horse fans, and so they were quite distraught when the museum was flooded. When you have a moment, there is some footage linked to the web links down toward the bottom of your screen that has some footage of the Kentucky Derby Museum flood taken from inside the museum as the flood was happening. This is a screenshot from that footage. Those two vehicles in the center of the picture were actually their outreach vehicles that they used to do educational programs. And that's what the parking lot looked like. By the end of the flood, there was at least a foot of water in many of the lower level spaces where many of the collections were kept. Several of the displays were in danger of experiencing some water damage, but the quick response from the staff and the training that they had been through before the disaster happened helped them recover a good portion of the material that was in danger. But the footage itself gives you a sense of what, if you have not yet been in a disaster or a crisis yourself, it gives you a sense of what the experience is like to be in the middle of it. One of the things that strikes me in watching the Derby Museum flood footage is how relatively calm the staff and the volunteers are, which suggests to me that they had some training before this happened. Here is where the raise your hand function comes in. If you could raise your hand and give us a sense if you've ever been in the middle of or had to respond to a crisis that involved your institution. So Jess had pointed out the raise your hand button at the top of the page if you would like to go ahead and hit that if you've ever been involved in one. I don't see many hands going up, which is probably a good thing. God forbid I wish this on anybody. So you can have some good stories.
This is just jumping in. I'm not sure if you can see this feature as a presenter as opposed to a host, but I see that 15 people in the group have raised their hand.
Okay, thanks, Jess. And you're right, I can't see the hands going up. So about 15 people have been involved with some. So my condolences. But I hope that your experience has proven helpful in terms of preparing for future responses, and that the outcome was good for your organization. I also hope, though, that that some of these characteristics that we discussed were in fact things that you experienced there. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit more specifically about planning for a crisis. There's essentially 3 stages that you need to plan for in a crisis. The pre-crisis phase, which is where you anticipate and prepare for the crisis or disaster that might happen. The actual crisis itself, where you work on responding to the crisis, and both with the actual recovery operations that you'll be engaged in, as well as communication. And then finally, the post-crisis stage, where there's some recovery and continuity that goes on. Each one of these stages involves communication. Each one of these stages helps prepare you for the next stage in terms of preparing and being ready to communicate during a crisis. So let's talk a little bit about the pre-crisis stage. As I mentioned a moment ago, the pre-crisis stage involves detecting, averting, if possible, and preparing for potential crises or disasters. This stage involves a couple of different things. But before we talk about that, I think it's important to understand that there are a couple of different kinds of crises that might happen to an organization. These categories come from the Institute for Crisis Management, which has been studying media coverage of crises for over 15 years now. Over time, they've identified 2 types of crises that seem to emerge. The first type is what they label sudden crisis. They're relatively unexpected events, they arrive with little warning, and the response time to those crises is accelerated. Many of you, a good portion of you, seem to be from the Mid-Atlantic region and probably experienced the good kite flying weather that we had yesterday with winds up to 60 miles an hour. There was power outages, there were trees down and all of that. That was a relatively sudden crisis. There was some prediction of it in the weather going back over the weekend, but it came on pretty suddenly and affected a number of organizations around here. Some categories of sudden crises would be things like natural disasters, weather emergencies, accidents that happen in or around your property, and crime. The one thing I'll say about these, though, is that many of these crises can be anticipated and planned for. If you live along the East Coast of the United States, chances are you will experience a hurricane, for instance. To not be prepared for a hurricane, especially after Superstorm Sandy and many of the other tropical storms that we've had, would not be a smart thing. The second kind of crises, then, are what the Institute for Crisis Management called smoldering crises. These are crises that are slow to develop, but they often provide some clues that they're developing. They could be prevented if detected, and there is a longer time to respond if you're vigilant, if you are keeping an eye on what's going on around your organization. Now, I will say that some of these involve things that are not necessarily under the purview of the disaster coordination efforts that many of your organizations have been in, where we're talking about large-scale disasters. These are more internal crises that happen within an organization, and I give some examples of theft and the degradation of the collection through mold or water leaks, sun exposure, problems with volunteers where, again, they might be doing something illicit or illegal. With regard to the degradation of materials, I remember one of the seminars I did with the Cultural Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, where in the morning we would have a disaster expert come in, and they would basically scare the bejesus out of most of the participants over what would happen. And he was talking about a museum that had a fine furniture collection. And every night the custodians would come in and clean up sawdust from under the furniture. Until one day, one of the pieces collapsed, and they realized that they had a major termite infestation. This had been going on for months, and no one bothered to, sort of tell anybody that, hey, we're getting a lot of sawdust around all this high-quality wooden furniture, so maybe we should do something about that. According to the Institute for Crisis Management, over 60% of the crises that have occurred to many organizations over the last 15 years or so have been smoldering crises, so that they have some indication that they might happen. I think you can combine the two when you think of some disasters, because we know that some organizations are better prepared to withstand, say, a hurricane than others are. And even though they know that they could be the victim of a hurricane or flood or blizzard or tornado or an earthquake, depending on what part of the country you're in, they still haven't prepared for what might happen. So this, again, influences the sort of research and vigilance that you might want to engage in before a crisis actually hits. The three main steps, once you understand the difference between a sudden and a smoldering crisis, the three main steps in planning are to research, prioritize, and if possible, prevent the crisis from occurring. There are a few things that, again, there's a lot of different ways that you can go about researching for a crisis, but a couple of suggestions that I'll make. The one, really, I think, relates to the experiences that many of you have had. You've looked around the cultural sector, the cultural preservation organizations, and you can see what has happened to other places. You sort of say a little prayer every night that it doesn't happen to your organization, but you know that there have been, fires and, different things that have happened to other organizations. I think the really good work that you do as an alliance is to prepare for those things kind of as a sector, so you can share best practices with people about how to prepare and respond to these things. So there's a lot of research ongoing in your sector about what some of those things might be. I would also encourage organizations to review their own operations and policies. For instance, do you have a fire emergency plan? I'm going to guess many of you do, but there are some institutions that don't. Not only in many municipalities is this a requirement, it's a legal requirement, but it's also just good, sound management practice. So do you have one? Because if a fire broke out in your organization and something happened to, say, a volunteer or your collection, that would be one of the questions somebody from the outside, like a reporter, might ask. The third thing is to think like an investigator or a reporter. If somebody were to come in and take a hard look at your organization, its structure, its operations, its policies, and so on, what would they find? And if what they found was something that was reported to the public, would you be embarrassed by that? Then finally, and I apologize for using the term, it used to be, that when I first learned about this principle of doing research, to think like a sociopath. But more recently, I think it's more apt to say think like a terrorist. If somebody intentionally wanted to do harm to your organization, what would they do? What could they do? I mean, the first place I would look is my computer systems, for instance, because the number one threat for a lot of organizations is a cyber attack. But again, if there are other things that might be vulnerable to the work of somebody who intentionally wanted to do you harm, it would be good to look at them and to harden them before something actually happened. Now, it's one thing to research the crises, and I hope that I'm not making you increasingly paranoid as this webinar goes on. It's another thing to sort of prioritize what you might plan for. You cannot, I think most of us do not have the resources to plan for every single contingency. And also thinking about all those can actually drive you a little batty after a while. I'm the sort of guy, because I've done enough of these things and have been studying crisis, I'll walk into an organization, like even a grocery store,
and will attempt to close.
And
If you wish to remain in conference, please press any key now.
okay, no problem. The webinar is talking to me. I'm the kind of guy who walks into a bank or an airport or a grocery store and I begin to look for the security cameras and where the exits are and everything. So thinking about this stuff over time can make you a little bit paranoid. However, one thing that helps you clear the clutter a little bit is to think about what the probability might be of these things happening. This is one version of a prioritization matrix. I think there are some other ones out there. It basically asks you to look at two things: the probability of something happening and the impact on the organization. Right? Some things are highly likely to happen and would have a high impact. Those are the things you want to prepare for first if you haven't already. Those things that are highly likely to happen but would have less of an impact would be the next things, and so on around the grid. The least likely to happen with the least impact you don't worry about until you have a little bit more time and resources to pay attention to them. So for instance, to give you an example of where some things might lie here, the graphic that I've just put up is a sample of a federal map on floodplains with various zones that are the way that various zones are divided based on how likely it is that a significant flood might happen or a storm surge. If you're in the site closest to the coast, you better be planning for floods and water damage. Right? Again, that makes sense, but it's surprising how many organizations plan for things that probably won't happen to them, as opposed to the things that will. On the other hand, if you're planning for a zombie apocalypse, I think that's highly unlikely to happen. Now, I know some people might disagree with me. My children, for instance, think that one is coming. And if you watch The Walking Dead, you might think that one is coming, but probably not. So very unlikely, very low impact, probably. And so that's something to note. Now, that's a silly example, but again, it's amazing how many organizations I've worked with where they spend a lot of time on things that probably won't happen to them. The final thing I'll talk about in terms of preparation before we get into the actual communication plan is to try to do some things beforehand to mitigate what might happen. A couple of things here in terms of prevention and preparation. If there's a way to fix the problem ahead of time, if for instance you have a wall that is structurally unsound and you can do some things to fix that, that would be good. If you need to upgrade your fire equipment and haven't done that, that would be good to do. And then create emergency response plans for the various highly likely, highly impactful contingencies that might be out there. This becomes very important when we talk about crisis communication, because a lot of what happens with crisis communication is telling people what your emergency response plan is. What's happening, what's going to happen. We'll talk about that here in a moment. The other things that you can do, and this is more communication, sort of a soft skills approach here, but I am happy to hear when Jess was going over the goals of these workshops that one of the important things is relationship building. So with that in mind, you might want to consider reporting something negative about the organization if it's something that can be fixed with resources. So, for instance, I've seen a couple of organizations that discovered problems with the way that they were protecting their collections that were things that could be fixed with a little bit more money. And so they used it as sort of the basis for a fundraising, a donor involvement project. And by the way, I know that's a real good sell with your executive directors and boards. Hey, we're going to talk about something that's wrong with the organization. So I understand that, but it is can be useful. You want to develop good relationships with all the people that you depend on, your volunteers, your staff, any vendors that you work with, your community, etc. If you're in the middle of a fight with somebody in your community and it's kind of a public battle over things like maybe parking or crowd control or zoning or whatever, and something happens to the organization, you'll have a little less credibility and a little less sympathy from people than you would in highly of you. You want to develop good media relations, so you want to be able to be seen as a dependable resource for good information on a variety of things, accurate information, truthful information, and helping reporters do their jobs. If you have that reputation, then if you tell a reporter in the middle of a crisis, I don't have anything to tell you about that right now, they're more likely to believe that as opposed to believing that you're hiding something from them. And then finally, you want to develop, you want to prepare to communicate. You want to make sure that all the tools that you might want to use in the event of an emergency are ready to go. And we'll talk about what those tools are here in the next section. All right? Okay. Now that you've thought about all the awful things that can happen to you, let's talk about putting a plan in place here. You know you're having a bad day when you have a group of reporters tagging along behind you, asking you challenging questions about what's going on in your organization. You also know that, or at least I know from experience, that a lot of people don't think about communicating in a crisis until an emergency actually breaks out. And then you'll see by the smiling PR person in the emergency case there that they want to put a happy face on things that are happening. Neither one of those is a really great response. You need to think about communication beforehand, and it's not always about putting lipstick on a pig and saying, oh, this is, things are hunky-dory here. Good, honest communication about what's happening in your organization as a disaster is happening is the key to good crisis communication. In putting a plan together, there are two components that you need to think about. I've already referred to one of those components in talking about the preparation that you put in place, and that's the operational response. What precisely is going to be done to solve the problem? So if you've had a flood, first of all, what are you doing to protect the collection? What's being done to move the collection? What happens when you go to recover and preserve the collection? I, for instance, didn't know you could freeze-dry a book until I started working with the Cultural Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. That would be something that people are going to want to know in the middle of a crisis. And then what others do to solve the problem. So the things that you're doing, but also if there are other first responders, federal emergency management people, other members of the Alliance who come to your assistance, what are they going to do to help contribute to the solution of the problem at hand? The second thing then, and the thing that kind of brings us here today, is the communication response. And at least in my opinion, the main bulk of the communication response is what you say about the first thing. What do you tell people about the operational response? That, to me, is what goes into the plan, particularly for some of the communication messages. Again, remember that crises are stressful, and if you can plan many of these things in advance, you can reduce the stress and the poor decision-making that might happen in the middle of a crisis. A little PR Communication 101 before we get into some of the nuts and bolts and the principles of putting a plan together. A communication strategy is what you say or do, the messages that you want a public, and by public I mean the media, your neighbors, volunteers, staff, employees, etc. What do you want them to see and hear? These include the actions you're taking. Actions speak louder than words. Key facts you want people to know. The story you want people to remember about your organization. What we've stood for all these years, what we hope to stand for in the future, that we do plan to recover and resume our operations, and so on. And then reassurance that yes, we're doing what we can to solve this problem and to recover, and yes, we will, if we're able to, we will reopen stronger than ever. Communication tactics, then, are all the tools that you use. All right? These include using the news media, which can be reached through social media. So reporters are on Twitter, for instance, and Facebook. The news media is everybody who might cover your organizations from any news organization, radio, TV, print, etc. The organizational media is what you already have. So your website, your newsletter, your Twitter feed, anything that you own yourself that can be used to communicate during a crisis. any interpersonal media or social media. So any interaction that you have with your volunteers, with staff, etc., one-on-one, that might help them communicate in the middle of the crisis. And finally, any advertising and promotional media. This usually comes a little bit after the crisis, where you might run ads to say, hey, we're going to reopen on these dates, etc. But it is still part of the media mix that you have at your disposal. We should tweet is not a strategy. And I will say again that I really think strategy is almost as important as the tools that you use to communicate messages. So with that in mind, here are some principles that involve both strategy, what you say and do, and tactics in putting a crisis plan together. I believe that good crisis communication is coordinated, quick, accurate, ongoing, and human. I wish I could come up with a catchy acronym for that. Maybe I'll use different terms one of these years, but these are the principles that have stood the test of time and have exemplified really good crisis communication responses. So let's talk a little about these. Coordination is the first one, and there's sort of two parts to this. The first is getting the team together to create the plan. Again, this is a step that you might be taking, and it should be taking, before a crisis even happens. So in formulating a crisis response plan, you might want to get people together. These people include decision makers. Who's going to be in charge of saying, we actually have a disaster on our hands and we need to implement the plan? Who needs to make decisions about where things are going to be moved, how it's going to be paid for, etc.? Some examples of these people would be the executive director or representative, any managers, depending on how large your organization is. There might be managers or people who supervise various collections. They might want to need to be involved in this. And then lawyers. I might add accountants as well, who can talk about some of the nuts and bolts of the ramifications for some of the decisions that you make. The second group of people are doers. These are the people who actually would be in place to fix the problem. So the actual responders, including firefighters, maybe police officers, etc., as well as anybody else you might bring in, recovery workers, engineers who might help structurally support what might have collapsed in the organization, etc. I also separate out volunteers here, because you might have random volunteers who come in just to help, but you might have a regular group of volunteers who aren't necessarily part of the management team normally, but might need to be brought in to have a sense of what the plan might look like. Then the second group would be those who communicate about it. For those of you who are large enough institutions where you have a marketing director, maybe a media relations person, people who handle your social media, etc., they need to be brought in here in terms of talking about the messaging and tactics that might be employed. The second way that I talk about coordination would be planning to keep people together, keep the team together during a crisis. And I believe that Steve is going to talk a little bit about this later on when he discusses the disasters that he's responded to. But is there a way, for instance, that key people in these areas of responsibility can stay connected during a crisis? Are there tools in that? We know that in many major disasters, the wireless networks, for instance, are affected. So what tools do you have for people to stay in touch with each other? And then finally, the way that the team might get together once a crisis, once a disaster is unfolding. Are there going to be regular team meetings? Are there briefings and things that the team itself goes through so that they can keep everybody on the same page? Right. I also suggest here a couple of questions that those team meetings might cover. What do we know? What's going to happen? What is happening now? And so on. So that's coordination. The second key principle for putting a crisis plan together is being quick. We know that with the advent of iPhones and live Facebook feeds and that sort of thing, if somebody sees flames on the outside of your building, they will start broadcasting that before the media even gets there, before you might even know that there's a fire happening in your building. So the speed with which people get information is accelerating even as we speak. However, there are some things that you can do to help keep up with that demand for information. First of all, you might anticipate questions that your publics or the media might have. Again, this goes back to the pre-crisis preparation that I was talking about a few moments ago. Do you have at your fingertips organizational facts, facts about the situation, things that are going on? How big is your collection? How long have you been an organization? What's the recent additions to the collection? What collections were housed in whatever structures were affected by the disaster? These are things that, again, you can put together. You can have a good intern over the summer, put together lists of, the collections and things that you have that you can then distribute to people who might need that information in the disaster. You can prepare explanations for the operational responses. So exactly how do you freeze-dry a book, for instance, right? I'm not sure I would be able to explain that, but you can talk to the people who would be helping you recover with that disaster and providing that service, and write up a brief explanation that you could distribute to volunteers, patrons, etc., so that they could understand what's happening. But again, you can write this before the disaster strikes. A little more specific to the crisis response is something called a standby statement. This is when you have reporters or publics or whatever knocking at your door or calling you up, tweeting you and asking what's going on. This is something that you can use at an initial press conference or a press briefing. And it's basically a statement that you prepare ahead of time, announcing that, yes, we know there's a crisis, and here's what we're going to do to communicate with you about it. It is enough to give the media that kind of information as a way of saying, okay, there's going to be some more coming, and we know that something's happening. And it buys you a little bit of time to find out exactly what's happening. I'll show you a standby statement here in a moment. And then finally, you need to be able to get the team together quickly. Anybody who has to make decisions and be on the ground responding, if it's possible for them to get there or to be in connection with you, as we mentioned before with walkie-talkies or wireless phones, etc. Right? And then finally, have all your tools ready to go. One of the things I mentioned here is a dark website, which is not to say it's a depressing website or anything. It's basically a web page with emergency information on it, contact numbers, steps to take, etc., that is kept on a server and not made live until a disaster actually strikes. And this is something that can be brought up, when the emergency has actually happened. A few years ago, quite a few years ago, when the shuttle Challenger went down, my son, who is actually now a pilot in the Navy, was a big space fan, and so we were watching it land. And we went to NASA's website. We were getting ready to go somewhere, but we popped on NASA's website. In 1 second, they were talking about the landing. Another second, the site went blank, and then another page came up that said, we've lost contact with the shuttle and have initiated our disaster emergency recovery plan. An instant, they were able to tell people, okay, something is happening, we'll keep you posted, but we wanted to let you know that that there's been an emergency. Right? Let me show you an example of a standby statement. You can see it's pretty generic. At this time, at our institution, we were advised that a fire broke out. Based on this information, we've initiated our crisis communication and disaster recovery plan. We're going to issue media statements every hour on the half hour, and a press center has been created in the cafeteria of the building 3 blocks from here. All right? Notice what this does for you. It's a statement that you can keep in a file or on your phone, and if you're stressful and you're still trying to make decisions, it's something that can be said to the media and others to say, we know something's going on, we'll get information to you when we have it, and that information will be gotten to you at this time. It gives you a way to sort of channel your response and to control things a little bit without having to make many decisions. You pull this out, you fill in the details, and you read it. Again, that can be a lifesaver, particularly if you don't have a trained media person on staff to help you out. This is a sample. I call it a hold page. It can also be seen as the beginnings of a dark website. This is from the Natural History Museum in England. It provides crisis information, and is the staff knows that this is a place they can go to get accurate information about things that are going on. This particular page is kept live, and they basically give you a status update that says, hey, nothing's happening right now. But similar pages can be filled in, populated with more information, and kept dark until the need arises. There's a lot of designers out there who know how to create these websites and make them effective for folks. All right. I mentioned before the Kentucky Derby Museum. They had a blog that they had started a few months before they had the disaster, the flood actually hit them. You can see that this is the initial response to the flood. Hey, we have something going on. We're going to begin to provide you updates here. You'll see off to the right that there are recent posts about when the museum is going to be closed and what parts of the Kentucky Derby field itself are open, what parts of the grounds are open, etc. So it was a quick way to get information to publics, and also became a vehicle as the disaster unfolded to keep people up to date about what was happening. All right. This is another version of the site, and I'll also invite you to take a look at the museum, Kentucky Derby Museum flood response video. That's the video that's embedded here, and unfortunately we can't play it right now, but there's a couple of things that it does very, very well that I hope that you pay attention to if you watch it. The first is, the basic information that, their communication director said, hey, we're closed, and this is why. But she also walks through the various things that the museum is doing, both to fix the problem, dry up all the water and fix the drywalls and everything, with a lot of detail, 600 feet of heated pipe with heated air going through to dry out all the areas that we had, for instance. She also shows some volunteers at work on the recovery of the actual artifacts in the museum, and then gives a sense of the things that are happening. Toward the end, she also asks for the public support as part of a fundraising campaign to reopen the museum. So she kind of touches on a lot of the different things that we have covered and will cover throughout this webinar. Immediate information about what's happening, an idea of what the actual operational response is, an idea of when things are going to open again, and places where the public can go to support and engage with the museum. All right, so I encourage you to take a look at that. Maybe not right now, but when you have the moment. Right? Another principle of good crisis communication is that it needs to be accurate. One of the primary principles of crisis communication throughout any crisis that you're dealing with is the one voice principle. There should be either one person or relatively few people who are the official communicators in the event of an emergency. That means your messages are going to be consistent. That means that there is one reliable person that the media and other people can go to for that information, and it just helps keep things relatively clean. The challenge here with an ongoing disaster, especially something that stretches out over several days, like a superstorm or a hurricane or something, is that that one person might get tired. And so there might be a couple of people who can step into the breach and fill in. The other thing, frankly, in any real emergency, a widespread regional disaster, that one person might not be able to get into a place where they can actually report to people and update folks. So you might want to have one or two people who are trained to be the voice of the organization. You get facts from whomever you can, first responders, investigators, the people who are helping you recover, and you check those facts and make sure they're accurate before you report them. You don't want to say, oh my God, I think the whole thing's wiped out in the middle of this, because if the whole museum is not wiped out, that would be an inaccurate statement, cause more panic and fear and upset than a more accurate statement. To the extent that you can, you try to control the channels through which information is going. This is the toughest thing of all to do in an era of social media. I mentioned the person with the iPhone can, go live and say, hey, here's what's happening at this place. However, to the extent that you can talk to your volunteers and anybody cleaning things up beforehand and say, if a reporter asks you a question, please check with one of us before you give an answer. And then if any of your employees have access to social media, and even the people who manage social media, you might want to brief them on the policies that you have in terms of checking information, getting messages sanctioned before they go out, again, to make sure that the information represents the organization accurately and isn't doing anything that might get you into trouble a little bit later. You need to let everyone know, and this is a tough thing for we know-it-alls to do, let everyone know what you don't know. If they ask you a question and you do not have the answer to that, say that. And then say, we will get back to you with the accurate information as soon as we can get it. Don't speculate or blame. A few years ago, the Philadelphia Zoo had a horrible fire. This goes back a number of years, right around Christmas time. And one of it affected the gorillas, the primate exhibit, and several of the animals lost their lives. Well, the zoo management held a press conference the following day and basically blamed the security guards for not monitoring the fire system. Well, the security guards had their own press conference the day after that and said, hey, we've been telling them the security system, the fire suppression and detection system sucks and hasn't been broken for months now. And so you can imagine what the media focused on after that. The point here is that you don't want to blame anybody. You don't want to speculate about what might have caused things until you have facts, right? And then if there are any rumors out there about things that are happening, you should correct those as quickly as possible, either through official media channels or through your own social and organizational media. The next principle is that it needs to be ongoing, so that over time you need to be prepared to keep people updated about things that are happening, even when the TV cameras go off and the reporters have put their notepads away. Your staff, your volunteers, your patrons are going to want to know what's going on. You might want to monitor the media. If you have a volunteer or a person who works on staff in marketing, they might want to pay attention to what the media is reporting, again, to make sure that there's no inaccurate information out there. And then monitor social media. We know how rumors can get started. We've all heard about fake news and exaggerated claims and those sorts of things. If there's a way to monitor what people are saying about you, and again, to jump into the conversation if things are inaccurate, then you should do that. I put the note here that all of these require resources, and I know that you have a webinar coming up soon on how to acquire funding for some of these response things. If you can get a few pennies to throw at communication tools, that would be helpful. All right. One last principle and a couple of specific things about tools, and then we'll begin to wrap things up here a little bit. You need to be human as much as you can. One of the big conversations in PR land has been about how you work with lawyers, because from all the TV police procedurals that the first thing they tell you when they read you your rights is that you have the right to remain silent, and anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. That's exactly the approach that lawyers take in crisis communication, unless you have a conversation with them ahead of time. So, for instance, can you say, I'm sorry that this has happened without, being blamed? Well, there's actually been heated conversations in crisis rooms that I've been in between lawyers saying, no, you can't say anything like that. And people saying, look, I'm sorry that this thing is happening to all of us, and we need... So basically you want to err on the side of being human without getting your organization into trouble. And having conversations with the lawyers ahead of time would help you. You should express empathy for anybody who's been affected by this. You should be honest and authentic in the things that you're saying. Again, if you say I don't know something, if the case is that you don't know anything, you can say I don't know it. I'm being honest here. Don't fight with anybody in public. Again, if there's a dispute over what happened and you're angry with somebody, don't do that in public. And then try not to panic. I know, easier said than done at this point after we've been talking about all these horrible things that can happen to you. But you need to, again, people are going to be sad or upset if something has happened to something they hold dear, like the things that you have in your collections. And you need to be sensitive to that in order to have a most effective crisis communication response. I want to talk a little bit about implementing the plan and then wrapping some things up. Implementation basically includes writing the plan down. Okay, you've come up with all these great tools and things you want to say. You've had an intern prepare all the emergency responses. You need to collect that somewhere where people can get to it. Once you've developed it, you should announce, hey, we've developed this plan, and then share it as appropriately with anybody who might need to respond. Here at LaSalle a few years ago, we had just come up with an emergency response plan to evacuate dorms in case of an emergency. It had been announced to the university, it had been practiced and vetted, and a gas main blew up just off campus. Spectacular 300-foot in the air flames. It was great. We made the evening news that night. But everybody knew what to do, because they had been told about the plan and had practiced it. That goes to the next point. Practice the plan and tweak it. So after running through it a little bit and seeing the things that where there were holes or things that need to be fixed, make sure it gets adjusted. You might want to set up a date for periodically revising and updating the plan as well. So you have the contact information for the person who moved out of the job 4 months ago. That's not particularly useful. And then repeat as needed, and hope that you never need to do that. And by repeating, I mean repeating the practicing and revising, etc. All right. Written plans typically have key contacts for the people who might have to respond, some lines of authority for who gets to make decisions in the emergency, and the sort of chain of command that might be in place. A checklist or summary of major operational responses, talking points that people would be able to read and distribute. A checklist of statements and communication tools to implement. A checklist of people to contact, including support staff and recovery specialists. So if you need to bring in an outside expert, I'm going to guess that the Alliance for Response has protocols for these sorts of things as well. And then finally, space and backup considerations. So where do you brief the media and the public if your building is in flames or underwater? Where do you take people? Is the website server in a place that could be flooded? And if it is, then where do you have a backup server somewhere? We worked with some of the responders in California through the State University library system, and I understand that they had backup servers in Arizona, in case something happened. If phone service is out, where do people call for information? Again, I understand that there are some agreements with other institutions that host sort of emergency phone lines for cultural folks. All right. So all these are in the plan. And you have the plan in a place where it won't be flooded. You have it on your phone. You have it backed up. You have it in print. You have it in places where people can get to it easily. I know that recently you had a webinar on tabletop exercises. I would just encourage you that once you have a plan in place that you do some practice with it. In some large-scale regional situations, there are drills that are coordinated by regional first responders.
Sorry, everyone. It seems that we've lost Mike's audio for a quick moment, but I believe that he's getting reconnected right now.
Yep.
Mike,
and I am. Am I back?
Okay, great. You're
Yep.
back. Wonderful.
Can you hear me? All right. Yep, sorry about that. For some reason, it bumps me off here every once in a while. So, for example, at LaSalle, we've had some, campus shooter drills where they've used actually my building as the emergency response area. And, again, those have been helpful in terms of letting people know what might happen in an actual crisis. There we go. I know that you just talked about tabletop simulations. add some of the crisis communication components to those simulations as well. When I've done these with the seminars that we did a few years ago for the Cultural Center, we would toss in, okay, the reporter calls you about the situation at this point, and you're hearing on the radio this is happening. Some social media went out that said, it's this, when in fact it's this disaster. And then you can talk through what some of the responses might be to those situations. And finally, testing the tools. Will your server handle triple the traffic, for instance? How can you bulk up that resource ahead of time? All right. Final thing, and then we'll let Steve get to talking about his experience. The most important thing to post-crisis recovery is to actually fix the problem. Obviously, that sends the message that you know what you're doing and that the institution has been able to recover well. A couple of other things you might want to keep in mind. Keep telling people about it. Give progress updates on construction or reconstruction. You might want to declare an end to the crisis that, hey, we've fixed everything, we're open for business, and we're going to be bigger and better than ever. You will then want to review your plan and prepare again. What did we do well? What lessons did we learn from doing this? And what can we do better in the future? Again, I'll close with some examples from the Kentucky Derby Museum. This is something that that blog that I showed you before gave updates about the progress they made. They actually declared, they made a fundraising campaign out of the recovery efforts. They were already planning to launch a capital campaign, and what they actually wound up with was several times more than they expected because they were able to leverage the news about the crisis to help them raise more money. And then they had a launch party, a public relaunch of the Kentucky Derby Museum. This is a page from the Courier Journal, which the newspaper in Louisville at the time. One of the web links that you have has a one-year flood anniversary news story about what they had done, and it really does, again, exemplify that notion of declaring an end to the crisis and saying we've moved on and we're even bigger than better than we were before. This, of course, is a success story. Hopefully any disaster that you face ends as well as theirs did. But it really does illustrate some of the things that can happen after a crisis strikes. Right? With that, I'm going to guess that Jess has been collecting questions that you might have, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. I want to thank you for the time, and I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
Well, thanks so much, Mike. That was great. I think for my part, I'd like to touch on these principles applied. That if I could use a sports analogy, you play the way you practice. And I can't emphasize that enough, and you had pointed that out as well, Mike, that we really do need to plan specifically for how we might approach the communications aspect of any response that we're involved in. And those the facets of that would be to plan, to practice, to apply, to review, and then improve. And if you're taking that seriously, you will very likely have a successful outcome as you are needing to dedicate your resources and your expertise at the time of need. So to look at what a deployment might mean and the communications aspect of that kind of effort, I think you go back to looking at the beginning that once a coordinator and administrator determines that there's a real need to act, to become involved in a on the ground sort of manner, that there's going to be an incident action plan that's going to be developed, but what the team should be focused upon, their goals are when they arrive on the scene is to assess and support. They're going to be supporting the goals of the institution or collection that they're attempting to assist, and the goals and priorities of the Alliance for Response Network or support system that you're part of. And in order to do that well, you're going to have to be able to report effectively. You're going to be gathering that information, and you're going to be pushing it forward in either direction, that there'll be a give and take depending on what the circumstances are. And I think that that's different in almost every circumstance, whether you're responding to an acute situation that might be very specific and contained, or something that's more of a regional event. They all have their challenges, and the application of all of this is slightly different in each regard. But in general, you're going to be following a plan that is set before you that facilitates those goals. There would usually be a team leader and a team assigned to respond, so that you're working in concert. There's interaction between that small group in the assessment and the support and the reporting component of a response. And you'll usually find that the way it is best organized is for the team leader to set up a daily meeting point to review what's in the incident action plan and develop a method and assignment of responsibilities for the team during that particular day. And you might also review the means and the times with which you might go about making those connections and passing information in one direction or another, because you may be working together as a unit, but you might be split up at times as well. So that daily meeting point would include that morning briefing. The daily task would be assigned, and then project that, depending on what the nature of the assignment is, that you'd most likely be having an evening debriefing, probably at the same staging area, where you'll be generating reports, and they'll all be funneled back to the team leader, which will then pass that along to the coordinator, who might most likely be off-site for action. And in preparation for that deployment, you're going to want to have copies of those important documents that you may save as PDFs, like the incident action plan, which is going to have your contacts and your addresses. You might download maps or upload maps or directions, and there will be report forms that you can use as prompts, or actually as a more of a spreadsheet sort of a manner of being able to collect data that you can, or information that you can feed back up the chain of command. But whenever possible, you're going to want to carry hard copies of all of the above, whenever that's possible, because you never know when electronics and digital media are going to conspire against you, and you think that you have everything covered, but at least during the day, until you get back to your safe staging area, you might not be able to access all of the things, all those important documents, using your digital equipment. So based on the incident action plan, you're going to determine a safe time and staging area for the briefing at the beginning of the day. And I guess why I'm going back to that is that we want to follow the incident command structure, and there being a chain of command, because as Mike said, you don't want to speak with multiple voices. You'd like to be able to have assignments, make assessments, collect data, information, make determinations as to what kind of materials, resources, whether it's personnel or specific materials that you might be able to apply to the tasks at hand, and then meet at the staging area at the end of the day to pass that along. Now, staging area can be anything, but it's usually going to be someplace where you're going to have, it's certainly going to be safe. It's going to, if you can have electricity and be a safe place to meet up. When that happens, you may choose it to be a public space that has Wi-Fi, for example. We made good use of that in the Sandy deployment, where we met up at a coffee shop, but it could be a Dunkin' Donuts. It could be a dedicated office in a school or an adjacent building that's nearby to the source of the event, or it may just be in a tent that's adjacent but still on the grounds of the event. Now, staying connected can really be a challenge. I'm certain that there wasn't a member of our team in New York that didn't experience some degree of frustration with finding that they'd used their phone battery so consistently throughout the day that at some point they ran out of juice, and they either had to retreat to a point where they could charge their phone again, or their tablet, or they just had to do without until they were able to meet up with another one of the team. So you're going to be able to make use of a variety of communication devices depending on your location and circumstances. And they typically tend to be either your phone, a tablet, or on occasion maybe a walkie-talkie will be the means that you have available. But that really depends on the resources available to the group that you're working with on the ground, and your group as well. And I'd like to point out that what we found is, not all data is equal, that there's such a variety. There's the text messaging, phone calls, email servers, Wi-Fi servers, and they have their advantages and disadvantages. Some draw more battery than others. But you make informed choices and as to when you get in touch and when you make reports, and you do want to stay online for periods of time when you're making reports, and you may be doing that verbally and identifying what kind of resources you might want to bring to bear or recommend to bring to bear to be of help. But in general, you're going to try to keep it as simple as possible and dedicate those response times to expected times at the beginning of the morning, perhaps at the lunch break, and then again at the end of the day. And that will keep it simple. People know when to expect your call. You're not wasting time trying to chase someone down and losing opportunities to be as effective as you really need to be. And staying connected, you might look at a variety of means of supplementing the energy that you have for your digital devices. There are such a good variety of things that are out there, some that are practical, some that are just gimmicks, but you need to make sure that you make some informed choices before you need to apply them. And again, if you're using this making use of these during practice times during the year, that you'll become comfortable with what you can get away with and what you can't when you're out in the field and needing to rely on batteries for backup. So key points in general, I'd say, are just to agree on methods of communication that's appropriate to the location and circumstances. You're going to have contingency plans, backups of, that there's, you'll expect that your primary means of communication might be phone and it might be email, but you may have to look at other workarounds, like perhaps using text messaging, which uses less data. You might be able to use phone service that goes through Wi-Fi, for example, like Google Voice or Skype, depending on what's available. And you're going to carry and download all your essential documents, carry your backup batteries, and limit power use when available. And you should be able to carry out all of the essential functions of your deployment and hopefully stay safe at the same time. Jessica, would you like to address some of the questions that have come up?
Certainly. Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you to all of the audience for your patience in getting to the questions. As you can tell, we had a lot of great content and slides to get through from Mike and Steve, so we do appreciate your patience. But if you do have any other questions, do feel free to go ahead and pop those in the chat window on the left-hand side of your screen. We did have one come in while Mike was speaking, specific to the Kentucky Derby Museum, wondering if they have conservators on staff. That was coming in from Celeste, and I will say I quickly checked. It doesn't appear that they have any conservators who are members of AIC, but Mike, are you aware of any relationship that they might have had with outside conservators that were on contract, or do you have any familiarity with what that setup was at the museum?
I don't exactly know. I do know that they, in order to conduct some of the conservation efforts, they contracted with one of the private vendors, whose name I can't remember, although if you look at some of the videos, you'll actually see their trucks in the background. And that a lot of the collection was taken up to Chicago for conservation. So that's makes me think that they might not have had anybody on staff, at least at that time, and that they had relationships with outside private vendors to do that.
It certainly seems that way. Thank you. That's helpful. I see there's a little bit of activity happening in the chat box. I wanted to just take a moment to kind of reinforce some of the points made by both Mike and Steve. I think you both did an excellent job of showing that a good crisis communications plan includes a lot of different audiences. Steve, I think, very effectively spoke to the needs of those who are deployed to help assist, either in the context of the National Heritage responders, folks who are going sort of out of their home base, but also for those who are working more locally with within their institution or their region, what some of those needs might be. And Mike, of course, you did a wonderful job addressing multiple audiences in terms of the public and the press, and just considering all of the different groups that we'll need to communicate with when we have limited means to do so. And I just want to hammer home again the point that Mike made very effectively, the importance of training, and encourage you all who weren't able to attend last week's session on doing tabletop exercises to please go ahead and view that program and think about some of the ways that you can conduct exercises on crisis communications related topics and put some of this content to good use. So there's a question coming in from Stacy wondering, she's curious if either of you come across communication plans that have emergencies classified in certain ways, such as this is what we say during a small crisis, medium, large, any type of different categorization that you've encountered.
I have seen a couple, and again, they don't really necessarily categorize it by small, medium, large, but more of the these are the things that can happen to us based on prioritization. So, for instance, they might say, okay, here's a personnel emergency. Somebody's been arrested, for instance, right? Here is a fire emergency or a flood emergency, because some of the procedures are very similar, and so on. I know that I have used actually a plan by the Big Brothers and Big Sisters of Colorado before. And again, it didn't deal much with sort of large-scale disaster response, but more the different types of crises that might happen to the organization. So that's, if you were to Google Big Brother, Big Sister crisis plan, that would be one that you would that would probably pop up and give you an example of that. I will say it is complicated. It's hard to cover everything. I have seen people walking around with 2-inch thick emergency binders of things. Not the most wieldy thing in the world, but it was pretty comprehensive.
Great, thanks for that, Mike. So I don't see any other questions coming into the chat window at this point, and we are getting close to the end of our scheduled webinar session. So I just wanted to take a moment here to kind of give a few words in closing. First of all, I want to thank all of the audience today, and Mike in particular, for dealing with some of the technical issues we had. It seems ironic that a crisis communications webinar would have issues with Mike, your audio getting disconnected and the computer calling into the program as well, but I'm grateful to you all for that, for being patient with that. So I just wanted to remind you all once again that we have a final program of this particular webinar series that's going to be on best practices for seeking funding, and that will be Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And to remind you all, of course, that the past sessions are on our YouTube channel if you have the opportunity to check those out. I'm going to go ahead and share an evaluation for today's program. Please do take a few minutes to fill out this brief 10-question survey. Information is incredibly valuable to us and will help shape future programming. I want to again thank you all for taking the time to join us today, and special thanks to our wonderful presenter and discussant, Mike Smith and Steve Pine. Thanks, Mike and Steve. And of course, we're really grateful to the National Endowment for the Humanities for making this series possible. Have a wonderful Tuesday, and we hope to see you all on Thursday. Thanks so much again.